So I work in a very fickle business, and I spent most of my summer trying to figure out and track and get good facts on what was happening on the Texas-Mexico border. Now the headlines have raced on around the world, and it's as though it never happened. There's no mention of it at all, partly because the numbers have gone down, and partly just because other world events have taken over. But it has been, it was an immense story, and it continues to be. And the implications are profound, locally, statewide, and nationally. Groups as large as 100 crossed the Rio Grande in inner tubes, in canoes, in rafts made by coyotes, in kiddie pools. The person I remember best was in Anzalduas Park, which is in South Hidalgo County, south of the Mission. There was a 16-year-old Salvadoran boy named Jorge Romero. And I found him sitting on the grass in the shade in this park. He was like a marathoner after a grueling race. He had just been detained by a county constable, and he was waiting for the Border Patrol. And so I was able to sit down and sort of get the outlines of his story. He had come from San Salvador, where he was escaping conscription into one of the Maras, one of the street gangs there. He had come up with a coyote. He'd had a pretty harrowing trip through Mexico. And he had, the day before, paddled across in an inner tube, and then the coyote told him, find the guys in the green uniforms and give yourself up. Which is why the coyotes like these clients so much, because they don't have to escort them all the way to Houston. They can just send them across the river and say, give up. So there was Jorge, waiting to be detained by the Border Patrol. And with this odyssey behind him, and his story was really just starting for me. And so his story has now been repeated tens of thousands of times. And let me just mention 8 of sort of the threads of the story that as a journalist that I've covered, and that I hope that, that our panelists today will elaborate on. Congress is considering a law proposed by a Texas congressman and a Texas senator to change the 2008 law that allows Jorge to stay here and to get his case heard in an immigration court. That's the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2008, which they're trying to reverse, so that Jorge would be treated more like a Mexican unaccompanied youth arriving here. The treatment inside the Border Patrol facility called hieleras, nicknamed hieleras, or ice boxes, is being challenged. It's cruel and inhuman treatment of the young people who stay there. Civil rights groups have filed a class action lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security because most of these youths who have come into the United States that are now in our immigration court system don't have attorneys. I remember watching in San Antonio as Berta Mejia Martinez, a 9-year-old from San Pedro Sula, sat in a chair in immigration court. Her feet didn't touch the carpeted floor. And thankfully she had a considerate judge who said, we're going to give you a continuance so you can get a lawyer. Civil rights groups have also challenged what they call the rocket docket, that some of the parents and children who are being detained close to us, even west of San Antonio in Carn City, in a brand new detention facility, that they get due process as Homeland Security tries to expedite the deportation. It's caused a crisis of confidence in whether how to secure the border. Do we triple the Border Patrol? Do we double it? Do we need more boats? 18-foot tall fences, helicopters, cameras, lights? Even though there's a question of would any of those measures have made a difference when Jorge paddled across the Rio Grande? The crisis has provided a very potent issue for the governor of this state in what's expected to be his run for the presidency. He wants to show that he's a take-charge commander, and so as we know, there's a sort of a Navy and an Air Force down in South Texas right now. The Department of Public Safety is down there helping out the Border Patrol, backstopping them, as are the National Guard. And finally, President Obama has said that he's considering making enormous changes to the immigration system in this country, unilaterally. And the political implications of that, if that happens before the midterm elections, could be enormous. But he could do that as soon as next week, or it could be after the elections, but that's also been brought about by this crisis at the southern border. So what we see happens 1,200 miles, on the 1,200-mile border, which is only 4 hours from Austin, is having direct consequences for the future of border control and immigration throughout the United States. And so we hope to explore that now with our 5 distinguished panelists. So I'm going to sit back and introduce our first, Marlene Guerrero Chavez with the Human Rights Coalition of South Texas.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank Paola Paloma Diaz for inviting me here today. Yes, my name is Marlene Chavez, and I am a founding member of the Human Rights Coalition of South Texas. It's located in the Lower Rio Grande Valley. And before I kind of start with the presentation, I do want to give a little brief background of the Lower Rio Grande Valley. We are comprised of 4 counties, which is Cameron, Willacy, Hidalgo, and Starr County. We are one of the poorest regions in the nation. And the majority of our population, about half of our population, lives below the poverty line. We are also known to have a high rate of worker exploitation due to the large majority being an immigrant population. So the humanitarian crisis, it began in the summer. Of course, at least the influx. I mean, this is not a new issue, it's been happening. I think the rates or the numbers of people crossing to the southern border have been continuously increasing from 2011. But then we saw the large influx this summer. But since October 2013, there have been over 60,000 unaccompanied children who have crossed the border. I do want to explain that there's a difference between unaccompanied children and then the families and the children who are crossing. The unaccompanied children are usually processed differently if they are pretty much essentially become wards of the government, and then are being taken care of by them, and then the officials decide, where they're going to place him, either with a sponsor or family member, and they still have to go through a court immigration hearing. Then you have the families, the women and children, and the men who are coming in, and those are the individuals who the Catholic Charities of Rio Grande Valley, the Food Bank of South Texas, the City of McAllen, and the Hidalgo County Department of Health and Human Services has been providing humanitarian aid. So all of these organizations or entities and agencies have gotten together and collaborated together and combined resources to provide the humanitarian aid. As far as I know, at this point, they have not received any federal funding for the resources that they have provided. So essentially, all the resources have been coming out of their own expenses. And I do want to clarify that many of these children and family and women who are crossing the southern borders, it's due because they're escaping the violence from their home countries. The majority are coming from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And as you can see, this is one of the kind of campsites. This is where, what ended up happening was that there was this massive flow of immigrants coming in. They didn't know where to place them, so they just started to just just send them to the McAllen bus station. And they just had them there, and then one of the community members started seeing the influx and started seeing the conditions, the depriving conditions that they were coming from. I mean, they hadn't taken a shower for days. They were either detained, sent to a detention center for 2 weeks without a shower, and then they were dropped off at the bus station with an envelope stating their court hearing process and where they would have to travel. I have to remind you that these individuals don't speak the language. They're from a foreign country, and they're just being dropped off like animals, essentially. That's what was happening at the bus station. So then the Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley, that's when they worked with Sacred Hearts Church to open to provide the humanitarian aid, and they started getting donations from the community. So they started getting donations for clothing, food, baby food. Then they worked with the Hidalgo County Health and Human Department to provide the medical aid. And as you can see, it's a very quick process. A lot of them kind of have their travel destinations. They come in like in the morning, and then they have to leave at 6 p.m. in the afternoon. So they just come in and then go. Approximately, they were seeing about 100 people per day, but now it's been in waves. They've been seeing between 40, then I'll go back to 60 people, then I'll go down, to 30, and I'll go back again to 100. So right now, it's really going in waves. And once again, this is just a picture of where they come in and they rest, they take a shower, they get some food. I did do some volunteering work with the shelter, and it's very sad to see the circumstances that many of these families are coming in. There was a 4-month baby-year-old who came in with scabs, and he needed medical attention, but unfortunately he had to leave that same evening. I believe it was to Philadelphia with a family member. So, so these are just examples of what is going on right now in the Valley. The way that the federal and the state have been responding, yes, the governor of Burnett Prairie just sent 1,000 national troops to the border. Approximately, it's going to cost $12 million per month to keep them there. The Obama administration also wants to invest $2 million to further border national security. And our standpoint as a community member and many immigrant rights groups, we do disagree with the way that they've been addressing the humanitarian issue. For one, you're talking about $12 million per month. That money can be rerouted and redirected to other social services and to other needs. We have to also clarify that a lot of these children are not given the due process, and instead of investing to hire more maybe attorneys to represent them in the court immigration system, they instead want to increase border security, which at this point, and as you can see, this is what's in our border, but it's impacting the community. You see our communities being torn apart. People have stopped taking their children to school. University students have stopped coming to class. People don't go out and do not shop as frequently. There was just recently, Isabel lives in La Jolla, and she works at a restaurant in Mission, both in Western Hidalgo County. She is the mother of 5 children, the youngest 3 years old. This happened last week. It was a petition that La Unión del Pueblo Entero did to advocate for her to be released, but unfortunately she was not. She was deported. But she was stopped by DPS state troopers for crossing the white line, and the next thing you know is that Isabel got arrested by Border Patrol because DPS was called Border Patrol and they arrested her. And now her 18-year-old daughter is taking care of the family, and her and is now getting another job. Another case story that happened was that Jose had recently won a 2-year wage theft case. He had been working for a torteria and getting paid less than the minimum wage. He had been living in the United States for approximately 13 years. He had no criminal record at all. He was just, surviving with the economic conditions. And then finally, with this wage theft case, he was able to, the family was just starting to get back in track with their life. He just had purchased a truck, and then he finally got another employment that paid him much better. However, on a Sunday afternoon, he was stopped by with his family by the local city police, and for having an expired paper license plate just by 1 day. And it was Sunday. He was going to go renew it on Monday morning, and unfortunately, the local police department called Border Patrol, separating the family and deporting Jose. So these are the true situations that are occurring in our community. And I just want to show pictures with the militias in the border. These are actual campsites, and these are militias in the border. Local efforts from our organizations, we've been advocating, doing a lot of grassroots advocacy. We do have a local pro bono network that has been going to the network to the shelter to provide legal advice for the families. And these are just some pictures, of course, that that I want to show you with, the actions that we've been doing. We are asking that our federal government implement humane policies and, stop investing and furthering the militarization and really, truly address the really solutions for the humanitarian crisis and the overall broken immigration system. Thank you.
Introduce Padre Ismael Moreno, a Jesuit priest, director of Radio Progreso, and the team for Reflection, Research, and Communication of Honduras.
Muchas gracias y especialmente muchas gracias por la invitación. Vengo y trabajo en Honduras y en torno al dato de los niños no acompañados, a mí me gustaría anotar que este dato no puede ser tratado ni de una manera solo coyuntural, ni tampoco quedarse en la calificación de crisis humanitaria, porque se trata de un fenómeno social y político que hunde sus raíces y que a mí me gustaría anotar 5 factores que los propongo como factores o hipótesis de trabajo y que se remontan en el caso de Honduras. Cada quien lo puede ver desde los otros países. En el caso de Honduras, desde hace unos 25 años. Primer factor, la decisión de impulsar un modelo con medidas neoliberales en un país de hambre, en un país en donde lo primordial no era tanto un modelo económico y político inserto en una comunidad basada en el capital y en las multinacionales, sino fundamentalmente presentar una propuesta de un país que pudiera tener bases básicas y elementales para hacerle frente a la sobrevivencia y a la marginalidad. Los ajustes económicos, a nuestro modo de ver, del neoliberalismo, es el primer factor que convierte a la migración como un fenómeno social. Segundo factor, el primer factor lo podemos ubicar en el año 1990 en Honduras. El segundo factor tiene que ver con la crisis que provocó el paso del huracán Mitch a finales de 1998, que generó una situación de devastación y de dejar en situación de población damnificada, la destrucción de la infraestructura, de la producción y el debilitamiento cada vez más de la capacidad del Estado ya debilitado para responder a los enormes desafíos. Este fenómeno del huracán Mitch disparó la migración, porque al cerrarse los espacios y la posibilidad de encontrar salidas, especialmente a la falta de empleo por parte de la juventud, abrió las perspectivas y Estados Unidos particularmente se convirtió en la válvula de escape. El fenómeno de la migración ya no solamente lo podemos definir como fenómeno social, sino un fenómeno social masivo a partir de y después de el paso del huracán Mitch a finales de 1998. El tercer factor, la ratificación de los tratados de libre comercio entre Canadá, Estados Unidos y México con Centroamérica y la República Dominicana en el año 2004. Este factor contribuye a que se abran las fronteras para los productos y para el comercio internacional dentro de una economía tan raquítica y empobrecida y miserable como la hondureña, que ocurrió fundamentalmente como consecuencia de los tratados de libre comercio y con la presencia impresionante del capital multinacional, que la pequeña, la mediana y la microempresa prácticamente desaparecieron. Las fuentes más importantes del empleo en Honduras queda subordinada o eliminada por la presencia del capital avasallador multinacional. Y entonces, al aumentar el desempleo de una manera masiva y al concentrarse todo alrededor de la agroindustria y del comercio definido por las multinacionales, la tierra deja de perder valor, la migración interna del campo a la ciudad aumenta, y entonces Estados Unidos y ya también España se convierten en un destino que se presenta como la única salida prácticamente para una juventud crecientemente desempleada y sin oportunidades. Se abren las fronteras para el comercio y se cierran las fronteras para las personas. Es cuando aumenta el endurecimiento de las políticas antimigratorias y discriminatorias en relación con los migrantes. El cuarto factor, el golpe de Estado del 28 de junio del año 2009. Ya veníamos de un proceso que desde el año 90 el fenómeno migratorio era un fenómeno social masivo, y tras los tratados de libre comercio y el endurecimiento de las leyes migratorias también peligroso. Pero con el golpe de Estado del año 2009 nos encontramos con un Estado completamente debilitado y una institucionalidad que queda subordinada a la ley de los fuertes. Hay un colapso de la institucionalidad hondureña y entramos a un campo terriblemente peligroso, y es al control de la institucionalidad hondureña y de todas las políticas por la ley de los fuertes, fundamentalmente por el crimen organizado, primordialmente el narcotráfico. Y entonces la sociedad hondureña, además de ser desempleada y de tener ausencia de posibilidades para impulsar una propuesta, se convierte en una sociedad violenta y atrapada por la criminalidad. En ese sentido, ya a partir del golpe de Estado, aumenta de una manera impresionante la migración de familias enteras, y ahí es donde entra donde va a crecer el fenómeno de los niños migrantes no acompañados. Por eso no es coyuntural. Y el quinto factor es, la corrupción y la impunidad al interior de un país como Honduras, de los sectores políticos y empresariales, que fundamentalmente están pensando en sus propios intereses y en utilizar la institucionalidad del Estado para su propio pecunio, en lugar de poner al servicio de propuestas políticas. Ese factor de la impunidad y de la corrupción es lo que al final de cuentas va a llevar a que el fenómeno de la migración sea la expresión de una sociedad atrapada en dinamismos crecientemente de deterioro. Y finalmente, la migración, en el caso de Honduras, que es desde donde lo estamos viendo, es la expresión de situaciones que desde las élites políticas y empresariales representan una discriminación y un desprecio hacia la población empobrecida. ¿Quiénes son los sectores que emigran? Aquellos sectores que, además de ser despreciados, están marginalizados de cualquier política y de cualquier propuesta social y económica en Honduras. Muchas gracias.
So moving along, to my right here, I'd like to introduce the Honorable Jerry Patterson, the Land Commissioner of Texas.
Thank you. Okay, I'll amplify my comments here. Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with you and discuss a topic that is on everyone's mind, particularly in the political venue. I'm 68 years old. The last subject that was this controversial and generated this much attention was during the Vietnam War, which I was a participant in. So this is the most controversial thing that I've been involved in. And I recently was in a campaign for another statewide elected office. I was unsuccessful, in part because this subject has reached the point where you can't talk about it. You cannot honestly, objectively discuss. If you are a candidate, you are relegated to saying things that can fit on a bumper sticker. That's your policy. If you venture outside the realm of a few bumper sticker-like comments, such as build a fence, no amnesty, secure our borders, you're in deep trouble. That's where we are politically. But I also would say that there's that old adage about if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. I will tell you that whether you know it or not, it's going to repeat itself. This state, and particularly we're a border state, we've got a longer border with, with Latin America, with Mexico than any other border state. This state, if you look at the history, you will see things that are exactly parallel with what's going on today. And frankly, some of these things that I'm about to talk about, for however long we are going to be here tonight, are far more worse. I'm an Aggie, I can say that. There are much more than what we were talking about today. Whether it's violence, whether it's militarization of the border, far in excess of what we are seeing today. And I put all this together. I know I listened to to the father talk about the economic circumstances that drive immigration, and then I listened to from the lower valley, trying to help folk and the symptoms of immigration. But in order to look at this, it's not immigration, it's not border security, it's not just assimilation, it's all together. And if you don't look at it all together, you're going to be dealing with symptoms and outcomes instead of actually getting somewhere. So I describe it as immigration, border security, assimilation. And when we're on the topic of assimilation, Texas has a long tradition, and my opponent in my election in 2010 was an 8th generation Texan. His name was Hector Uribe. He'd been here a lot longer than I have. But we talk about the commonality that we had, but the problems we have today were common back many years ago as well. We had a lady governor, and some of you may be thinking that I'm talking about Ann Richards, but I'm not. I'm talking about Mary May, called her Ma, her initials were M.A. Ferguson, Ma Ferguson. Back in 1922, when she was actually the governor, but she was actually the mouthpiece for Paul Ferguson, who had been indicted, or actually been impeached and removed from office, we had a problem in our public education system. We had children who weren't English speakers. They were primary Spanish speakers. Ma Ferguson was asked, Ma, what do we do? Governor Ferguson, what do we do about these children who are not English speakers? And she responded by saying, we're trying to figure out that time today we're trying to figure out whether we use the bilingual method or the immersion method. Back then they had the same question, but they just said, do we teach them in English or teach them in Spanish? Ma Ferguson responded with what I believe to be one of the most infamous quotes in Texas political history, when she said, if English was good enough for Jesus Christ, it's good enough for the school children of Texas. So if you think we're in the dark ages, now, just go back and look at history. Now the other thing, there's some discussion about the National Guard. Governor Perry mobilized 1,000 members of the National Guard, sent them to the border. President Obama, I think, sent a couple of thousand to the border in 2010, I believe it was. George W. Bush sent 6,000 to the border when he was president. None of that is of any significance, because in 1916, Woodrow Wilson sent 110,000. Called up the National Guards of all 48 states and sent them to the border of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to fight real border violence. This stuff that's going on now is not even violence, and most of it's occurring, unfortunately, shouldn't occur anywhere. Most of it's occurring in Mexico. 110,000 members of the National Guard. We fortified our border in the lower Rio Grande Valley, mostly in the Trans-Pecos region, going into New Mexico. We had border violence. Pancho Villa raided Columbus, New Mexico. Killed 20 people. We had raids into Texas, killing ranchers. We had tragic raids into Mexico, killing innocents who were not involved. The parallels are similar. We had parents. When the Mexican Revolution commenced in 1910, it lasted until about 1920. We had a revolution, then we had a civil war among the combatants. We had initially Diaz was overthrown by Madero, then we had Villa, we had Zapata, we had Carranza, we had Huerta, we had Orozco, we had all these, and they would either fight each other and then sometimes would ally with each other and fight the government. But what happened? There were 1 million people killed in Mexico. And what did the parents do? They sent their children north to avoid the violence. The cartel of the day was the various revolutionary armies. So we have the same thing. We were smuggling arms being smuggled into Mexico. Same thing. We're smuggling arms into Mexico for Villa or Carranza or one of the other revolutionary organizations down there. Drugs smuggled this way. Yeah, they were smuggling drugs. Mostly it was Sotol, which was a very intoxicating liquor. So what I'm saying is there is nothing new that's going on today. It's all been done before. And of course we can learn something from that if we choose to. But unfortunately, we're not able to do so. Because we've reached the point in discourse on this subject so that it's not so much as what you say as it is who is saying it. We've reached the point that if a Republican says it, a Democrat has to disagree. And if a Democrat says it, the Republican has to disagree. And we are in really sorry shape, to be very honest with you. And politicians are not serving you well. We talk about spending, and it was mentioned that we're spending $12 million a week, and I think that's accurate, maybe a little more, a month, on funding the guard presence on the border. We actually spent more in the legislature, 35th legislature, as a percentage of budget. We authorized $500,000 for border security. We hired new Texas Rangers, which were really just cowboys. If they gave them a gun and a badge and no training whatsoever. It was a bad time. It was a really bad time. We have a system, we don't even have a system, we have a scheme of immigration. And frankly, the illegal immigration scheme was working fairly well when it was circular, when someone could come here to work for 2 or 3 months and then go home to the family. That worked pretty well. It was illegal transit in 2 directions, but it was working. So what we have done, we've taken that and we've made it no longer a circular, albeit illegal immigration system. It's a unidirectional system in which if you can get here, you can't go home. So therefore we create an incentive that's opposite to our wishes, because now that worker that's here, who was quite happy to make, $10, $20 an hour, roofing houses or whatever, sending half of it home for his family, and was quite happy to go back and forth, and was happy with that circumstance, cannot do that anymore. It has an incentive to bring the family here. So we're working against the things we say we seek. We're working against border security, we're working against assimilation, and I don't know what we're going to do to fix it. But I know that the course we're on right now is not a very good one.
So let's move now to Licenciada Ana Lorena Siria de Lara. She's the consul of El Salvador in Houston. Great. Welcome to Austin. And again, she'll be speaking in Spanish, so if you have the simultaneous translation devices.
Okay. Buenas tardes a todos y todas. En primer lugar, un agradecimiento muy sincero para el Instituto Lilas Benson de Estudios Latinoamericanos de la Universidad de Texas. Muy agradecidos en nombre del Gobierno de El Salvador por estar interesadísimos en abordar un tema que ha hecho grito y eco, yo creo, en toda Latinoamérica y ha impactado mucho a una población aquí en Estados Unidos. Me siento muy honrada y es un placer para mí estar aquí compartiendo con ustedes. Muchas gracias. Comparto con mi hermano hondureño mucho del tema, de las razones de la crisis humanitaria. Creo que están muy compartidos. Lamentablemente, como región centroamericana, y no voy a hablar solamente de El Salvador, sino de la región centroamericana, porque somos una región, las condiciones económicas, las condiciones sociales han sido muy difíciles para nuestra región, en todo el sentido de la palabra. No ha habido un abordaje de los indicadores que han generado en nuestra población condiciones para quedarse en El Salvador, condiciones para quedarse en Honduras, en Guatemala, en Nicaragua, en Centroamérica en general. Pero quiero abordar de manera particular este tema de la crisis humanitaria porque como cónsul me tocó que vivirlo de forma directa, ya que nosotros en el Consulado General de El Salvador en Houston tenemos la jurisdicción de toda la frontera sur del estado de Texas y tuvimos que ir directamente hasta los centros de procesamiento de la Border Patrol y poder ver de nosotros directamente las condiciones en las que nuestros niños, niñas y adolescentes estaban siendo recibidos. Y créanmelo, partí del corazón poder ver. Quiero plantear algunas cifras porque solamente tenemos 8 minutos nada más. Pienso que es muy poquito tiempo, pero bueno, vamos a tratar de respetar este tiempo. Según fuente del gobierno de los Estados Unidos, en el tema de la crisis humanitaria, en el periodo de la crisis humanitaria, ingresaron alrededor de 57,000 niños y niñas y adolescentes. De estos, 17,000 eran salvadoreños. Nosotros dimos atención directa a una cifra de 2,283 niños, niñas y adolescentes. ¿Cuáles son las causas? Ustedes lo saben, nosotros tenemos a una población salvadoreña emigrando a este país desde los años de 1980. Tenemos ya una cuarta generación radicada en este estado, particularmente estamos hablando de alrededor de 300,000, entre 300 o 350,000 salvadoreñas y salvadoreños que radican en el estado de Texas. El tema de la reforma migratoria vino a generar un impacto muy fuerte para que nuestros niños, niñas y adolescentes no acompañados, y eso es lo más triste del tema, quisieran ingresar a este país de forma irregular. Hubo una falsa campaña de los coyotes diciendo a la población aquí y a la población nuestra en El Salvador de que los niños iban a ser reunificados con su familia. Las edades de los niños promedio que tenemos en las estadísticas están entre los 12 años y los 17 años. Porque también se dio la información que los que ya tenían 18 años no iban a ser reunificados con su familia, y en efecto ha sido así. Los coyotes generaron una campaña de desinformación terrible en nuestro medio, y en nuestro punto de vista y en el análisis que hemos realizado, ha sido una de las variables más impactantes para que hayamos tenido un ingreso tan masivo de adolescentes, niños y niñas ingresando de forma irregular a este país. Lo siguiente es que las familias aquí, especialmente las madres que tuvieron que emigrar y dejar a sus niños de pequeños, vieron la oportunidad de reunificarse con sus hijos. Las mujeres que estamos aquí, como madres, podemos saber que ese es un tema muy importante. Vimos, y lo vimos de primera mano, muchos de estos niños quedaron en El Salvador siendo pequeños. Apenas tenían meses cuando las madres emigraron. Y cuando vimos y fuimos testigos de los procesos de reunificación familiar, estos niños no conocían a sus madres, porque los dejaron siendo realmente muy pequeños. Eso para nosotros es una de las segundas causas. No podemos obviar el tema de la crisis económica, no podemos obviar, por supuesto, el tema de la violencia que lamentablemente vive en la región de Centroamérica y México. El tema de la violencia ha impactado muchísimo, muchísimo. Pero el tema de la desinformación, en nuestro punto de vista, fue el tema realmente que más impactó. Ustedes pueden ver la cifra proporcionada por el gobierno de los Estados Unidos, 17,000 niños. No podemos hablar de una cifra exacta porque lamentablemente no tuvimos acceso a la información como gobierno como hubiésemos querido. Una de las primeras situaciones que hicimos fue llegar a la frontera en McAllen y hacer uso de nuestro derecho como gobierno para poder garantizar el derecho de nuestros niños y de nuestras niñas, para poder ver de primera mano las condiciones en las que realmente estos niños estaban. Otra de las siguientes causas que realmente ha impactado mucho ha sido la desatención en el tema de los programas educativos y sociales en gobiernos anteriores, que lamentablemente no hubo un enfoque. Tenemos todavía en este momento y se están revisando programas educativos que no respondían a las necesidades nuestras. Nuestro país es muy hermoso, nuestro país tiene una comida muy deliciosa, tenemos una cultura increíble, arraigada, tenemos una población valiente, luchadora. Todas esas condiciones que planteó mi hermano hondureño son ciertas realmente. Nuestra gente no viene porque realmente quiera venir, viene porque lamentablemente no tenemos las condiciones para que nuestro pueblo se quede. Los que han tenido la dicha de ir a Centroamérica pueden verificar de primera mano que tenemos unas hermosas playas y condiciones muy buenas para quedarse, ¿verdad? Pero lamentablemente ha habido una cantidad de variables que han permitido y han llevado a nuestros niños a ponerse en riesgo. La ruta migrante por la que nuestros niños, niñas y adolescentes pasan en México es muy lamentable. A mí particularmente me ha tocado que buscar niños de 12 años desaparecidos en México, adolescentes que perdieron su vida en el intento de ingresar a este país. Y eso realmente es muy triste para nosotros como gobierno, porque son los niños, las niñas y los adolescentes el futuro de mi pueblo. Y lamentablemente estos niños han tenido que arriesgarse al venir a este país de forma no acompañada por querer reunificarse con la familia. Agradecemos mucho este valioso tiempo y muchas gracias por la invitación nuevamente. Gracias.
We've been joined by Denise Gilman, who co-directs the immigration clinic here at the UT Law School. Thanks for coming, Denise.
Thank you very, very much, and thank you to Lilas for holding this very important event. I can't tell you how pleased I am to see how many people are here today to think more deeply about these issues and to learn more about them so that we can think about a path forward. So I want to start by talking first about the positive tradition of the United States in receiving refugees and welcoming refugees and integrating them, and the humanitarian generosity of the United States, because I think it's important to put that background out there. The U.S. takes about 90,000 refugees and asylees in a year. That was the figure from 2012, which is the most recent year. That is a far greater number than any other country in the world takes, either in terms of real numbers and for the most part in terms of per capita numbers as well. It truly is a generous policy. Am I not? Are people
Speak closer to it.
Maybe we should switch. ¿Podemos cambiarnos? Sí. Solo para no. While the United States has this strong tradition of generosity towards refugees, we have also had embarrassing moments, legacies that are very negative when there have been moments of true need causing refugee flows that are more serious and more significant. For example, in World War II, 900 Jews fleeing Nazi Germany just came on a boat, got close enough to see the lights in the Miami harbor, and were turned away from the United States, sent back, and more than 200 were subsequently killed in the Holocaust. That's not the only example, of course. We have the experience of Haitian refugees seeking protection in the United States in the 1970s into the 1980s. First, immigration officers denied all of their asylum claims, and then we set up systems that prevented them from even making those claims. Their boats were interdicted on the seas so that they could not even enter the U.S. to make their claims. We have experiences that are even more specific to Central America, that aren't completely unlike the situation that we're seeing right now. In the 1980s, we rejected many claims, very valid refugee claims from Central Americans based on largely political considerations. Salvadoran claims at the time were rejected in very high numbers because of our affiliations with the Salvadoran government at the time, whereas Nicaraguan claims were accepted in much greater numbers as a result of our political emphasis there. These differential treatment results spawned significant litigation and eventually even a realization by Congress that something had to be done regarding the injustices and the inequalities such that legislation was adopted to try to create a better situation for Salvadorans. Similarly, with some of the other incidents that we've seen, the experience of the St. Louis really was the incentive for the creation of modern refugee policy in the United States. So we look back on these moments with a great deal of shame, and I'm very afraid that we're going to be looking back on the moment right now with a great deal of shame in the future, because the response that we have adopted, that the administration of the United States has adopted to the current situation, refugee crisis, humanitarian situation, is highly problematic. And it's a shame because we do have a refugee system in place that provides for a system for sorting out valid claims from claims that are not valid, that has a process that takes care of processing these claims, and it really comes from the 1980 Refugee Act. Ted Kennedy noted right after he pushed the legislation through that this was really a crucial issue for fair treatment, but also one for foreign affairs, for peace and justice in the world. He said that it is clear that refugees pose critical foreign policy issues for the United States and the international community, and he recognized massive refugee movements can unbalance peace and international stability. But he made the point that the Refugee Act, if we use it wisely, if we deploy it, will serve the country's humanitarian traditions and will also serve the cause of peace. And that's exactly the situation that we're in right now. But rather than adhering to and ensuring that we're providing the protections that exist in the law, we are abandoning those protections and those processes. So let me just describe a little bit from sort of a legal perspective of what is happening in terms of the treatment of the children and the families who are arriving on our borders. So for children, the unaccompanied children who come by themselves, as described by already panelists, they're received with terrible treatment at the border. I mean, that is objectively, has been documented quite well, that Border Patrol has engaged in very humiliating and abusive behavior. The children are then placed in shelters, and they are mostly released to family after a period of time to ensure that reunification is proper. And that is a good thing. They should be released to family while they go through their immigration court proceedings. They are all placed in deportation proceedings in immigration court, even if they're reunified with their families, and they will have to continue to appear for court. But it is still a good thing that they're able to do that at their home with their families. However, the deportation proceedings have been expedited. They are taking place in a very truncated manner. The order from the headquarters of the immigration courts is that every case should be heard, at least on a first hearing, in 21 days after the child arrives in the United States, after the child is put into deportation proceedings. That is not enough time for a child to provide an attorney. Most of you may know that in immigration proceedings, you are not offered an attorney sponsored by the government. You must go find your own private attorney or nonprofit to represent you. Nor is that enough time to put together a claim. Of course, advocates, legal advocates, want prompt adjudications of cases, prompt and fair adjudications. We do not want curtailed processes. That's no process at all. There's no chance for a child to present their claim in that situation. And in fact, there have been legislative proposals to curtail the proceedings even further and to create a situation in which the cases would be even further expedited, and in which case, in which circumstances, certain children would be turned away within a matter of weeks if a low-level official determined that they weren't eligible to go forward on a claim in immigration court. And those proposals are deeply troubling. All of this is in part a symptom of the fact that enforcement resources in recent years have been increased and increased along the border, while there has been no similar resourcing of the adjudication system. And so it is true that there have been very significant delays in the immigration courts. And so that has led to some concern that children are released to their families, and then their court cases take 3 to 5 years, and there's no resolution, and meanwhile they're in the United States. But that problem is much better addressed by resourcing the courts and allowing for a fair adjudication process, rather than increasing enforcement resources once again and in focusing on the enforcement side. I want to mention what's happening to the families who are arriving, because there are many of the children who are coming with their mothers, some with their fathers as well, but many with their mothers. So these are the same kids as those kids who are in unaccompanied minor situations where they get released to their families and go to court. However, the kids who are with their moms are actually treated worse, and I really want to make sure that we focus on this. They're treated worse in several different ways. First, they do not automatically have a right to go to court to see a judge to talk about their claims. They are placed in expedited removal proceedings, which means that they may be immediately turned back, or if they ask for asylum, they will be given a screening interview by a low-level official. If they pass that, they may go forward in court. If they fail that, they will be immediately turned back. In addition, even if they do pass that credible fear screening interview, that asylum screening interview, and go forward on their cases, they are detained in immigration facilities, ICE immigration facilities, not like the unaccompanied children and health and human services facilities that are prepared for children. They're detained usually in privately operated immigration detention facilities. And the government is insisting that even though these children and their mothers should be eligible for release or release on bond after they pass that screening interview, that because of the current emergency situation, they must be held without bond throughout their proceedings in these facilities. This is unprecedented in terms of the treatment that we give to any immigration detainee, much less women and children seeking asylum. Of course, the conditions in the facilities are problematic, but in any case, detention of small children is problematic in any circumstance. And these children often are smaller, younger than the unaccompanied children. They're 2-year-olds in jail with their mothers. I'm already being asked to wrap up, of course, fair enough, but I just want to sort of, I'm not sure what all was covered previously, and I want to make 2 important points. One is, first of all, I really want to call into question the terminology of the border crisis. Overall numbers of illegal crossers into the United States, irregular immigration, is at a historic low, acknowledged by everyone, acknowledged by the U.S. government. Women and children are actually still a very small percent of those who are crossing the border. And so to the extent there is any concern about a mass influx, it is true that the numbers of women and children are increasing. There's no doubt about that because of the conditions they're fleeing from. But if there is a concern about unlawful border crossings, the enforcement efforts really should be directed at the overall situation, rather than focused on the women and the children who are the most vulnerable and most likely to have come for reasons of seeking asylum rather than other reasons. And then the other point I want to make is that, I talk a fair amount about sort of due process concerns and liberty issues, being free from detention. I hear a lot of commentary in the discourse right now that says that, well, what's the point in sort of providing these protections if they all just came here unlawfully and are going to be returned anyway? And you hear that really from all sides of the spectrum. Well, I think that's a basic misunderstanding, which assumes that they will all eventually be returned. It's just a question of how much process we give them, whether they'll be released. But probably, by many estimates, about 60% of those who are presenting themselves, in fact, have very valid claims for relief under existing asylum law or other forms of law, and we just need to give them the opportunity to present those claims, and then they won't be returned at all. And so we will have done ourselves a huge favor by treating them properly and humanely because they're going to be living here amongst us in this country. And then finally, these are real lives. I just want to end on that point. Yesterday, we finally obtained the release after more than a month of a family, a mom and daughter. The daughter was a 6-year-old little girl who had brain cancer. She has brain cancer. She has a tumor. ICE refused to release her on this policy of no bond because the national security crisis caused by this woman and her child was too great to allow for release. Only after extensive advocacy were this mother and child released into a shelter here in the Austin area. Thank you.